We're off. Okay. So, on Tuesday, we talked about the urinary system. Today, we're going to talk through the reproductive system. Chapter 27 only has 3 sections. It has a section on the male reproductive system, a section on the female reproductive system, and then a section on the development of the reproductive system, talking about structural development and hormonal control. And so as we go through here, we're going to emphasize some big picture questions about why are gametes structured the way that they are, how are they developed in that way, how does this process work, and then some major ideas about the structures themselves and the development. So we're currently, if the one person in this room that has yet to do it actually finished it, then we may be down to 6 people left to finish the cafe. And so we are making good progress towards the goal of getting everybody in the class to finish it, so that in addition to having your lowest exam score dropped, your second lowest score would be replaced by your highest score, regardless of whether it's the final exam or one of the other 4 exams. So I have not posted the study guide yet. I told you I would on Tuesday, and it's not for lack of opportunity. It was just for lack of thinking on my part. I just have totally blanked on doing it. I will get it done after this class. The study guide will be posted. And so the way the study guide is going to be structured is I'm going to point you to the specific sections of the slides that you're going to be tested on. Okay? And so that way you can, in some ways, not focus on some of the sections from the material that we've been covering since the previous exam as you prepare for exam 4. All right? Any questions? Yeah.
So exam 4 is going to cover, is it chapters 24 through 27?
So it'll be 25, 27, and 24, and that, yeah, is, yeah, that's, yeah.
But you're going to put the slides in the...
Yeah, I'll put you to the specific, the slides are already online, but I'll point you to specific sections on the slides that you need to focus on as you prepare for exam 4. All right? Let me pray for us, and then we'll get started. Father, thank you for another opportunity that we have to study your creation. Father, give us an appreciation of why our bodies are designed the way that they are, and through that to get a better appreciation of who we are biologically and what that means, and how we can just have a better sense of you as creator. And Father, as we are in the midst of the hardest time of the semester, give us strength and remind us of the incredible opportunity that we have, so we're less likely to be wasteful. And Father, I ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. So chapter 27, reproductive anatomy. 5 framing questions. Why and how are mature gametes haploid? So we're going to talk about this whole haploid-diploid issue with human cells, and why gametes need to be haploid, and how we actually make and generate haploid cells. What are the unique features of mature gametes? So here we'll talk about male gametes and female gametes, and how they are unique compared to each other, but then also how they are unique compared to other cells, what we would call somatic cells, anything that's not a gamete. What is the path that sperm travel to the oocyte? Why does fertilization take place in a specific place, typically? How is the menstrual cycle regulated? And so when you're talking through this, we'll talk about what triggers the difference between continuing through menstruation versus allowing implantation. And then how do the reproductive tracts develop, and when do hormones kick in? So first, why and how are mature gametes haploid? All right. Normal functioning human cells and normal functioning animal cells, for most animals, have 2 copies of the genome. We call this condition diploid. And so one of the copies comes from the mother, one of the copies comes from the father, at least in sexually reproducing animals like humans. And so it's very important that you have both of those copies for several reasons. One if you get a bad copy of a gene from one parent, you have the potential to have a good copy of that gene from the other parent, right? That's advantageous. Two is sex chromosomes. So human sex is determined by chromosomes. Having two X chromosomes versus males having one X and one Y chromosome, having those two X chromosomes allows you to be able to shut one down and then allow the other one to still operate. Another thing is there's just some fine tuning of the cell in terms of controlling how much product gets made from those genes, and the right count is really important. So the gametes, sperm in males, ova in females, have to fuse together to form what's called the zygote. Have to fuse together to form the first cell of the developing embryo. So each of these gametes has to only have one copy or be haploid in order for when they fertilize, when the sperm fertilizes the ovum, you get a diploid cell. Okay, and then that way your zygote is diploid, the first cell of your embryo, and every division after that, the cells maintain being diploid. So that's the why. Now, what would be another alternative? So if the diploid condition is what is needed, okay, so the diploid condition, two copies of the genome is needed, other than fusing two haploid cells, what's another option? So mitosis is cell division, right? And so what you get through the process of mitosis is you get cells that are genetically identical. So after the process of mitosis, you take one cell, you generate two cells. If your beginning cell is diploid, your ending two cells are going to be diploid. But if you need that diploid condition, right, and you're going to have sexual reproduction, so a cell from one individual is going to fuse with the cell from another individual, the way humans do it is those two cells that fuse together are haploid. They each have one copy of the genome. Another alternative would be to fuse two diploid cells and then afterwards cut the amount of DNA in half. And some animals go that route, that they still need to have their normal cells being diploid, but they have two diploid cells fuse, giving 4 copies of the genome, and then after that, the number of copies is cut in half. Either way, at some point you have to cut the amount of DNA in half, right? Right? You either need to go from 2 copies down to 1 as you make the gamete, or you would need to go from a zygote that has 4 copies to a embryonic cell that only has 2. At some point you have to cut the amount of DNA in half. This process is done through what's called meiosis or meiosis. And so again, the human strategy is to cut the amount of DNA in half prior to fertilization. It's done through meiosis. Meiosis takes place in 2 cycles. The first cycle is called meiosis 1. And so here, the homologous chromosomes, the one that came from the mother, the one that came from the father, line up side by side during meiosis 1 and then are segregated into 2 separate nuclei. So you start off with your maternal chromosome and your paternal chromosome side by side, and then during the process of meiosis 1, the 2 are separated apart, and at that point you've cut, bless you, you've cut the amount of DNA in half. You've segregated the maternal chromosome into one nucleus, the paternal chromosome into another. You have accomplished getting a haploid cell. During meiosis 2, the second cycle, this is where the 2 copies of each of those chromosomes, so the DNA has to be duplicated beforehand, and so your maternal chromosome has 2 copies attached together. The paternal chromosome has 2 copies attached together. So during meiosis 2, those 2 copies are separated and segregate into separate nuclei. All right, so after 2 cycles, you started with 1 cell and you generate 4 cells. 2 cycles of division. And you're left with 4 cells that are all haploid, that all have a single copy of the genome. And for each chromosome have either the paternal chromosome or the maternal. And then if you know more about the process, you realize the chromosomes mix and they scramble their material during that process as well. So you don't get quite a full maternal chromosome or quite a full paternal chromosome. So this is how it's accomplished. And so again, meiosis can happen after fertilization and does in some animals. So two diploid cells fuse together to make what's called a tetraploid cell, a cell with 4 copies of the genome. And then meiosis happens to restore the 2 set condition. All right, so we're going to take our first lecture break. Again, I want you to get yourselves into groups of 6, 7, or 8 individuals. And I want you to talk about this. Why can't human cells have more than 2 copies of the genome? Why is it necessary for us to have that diploid condition? Think about this process and why it would make sense for it to need to be highly controlled. Take a couple of minutes, assemble your groups, get a discussion leader, get a representative, and 2 minutes starting now.
You have a lot more power. You remember
Stop.
There's no way.
Like this isn't exactly. Yeah, he's at 16.
Wait, why did our
Were you kidding me? When you start messing with
Oh, okay, great. Oh, no. Okay, so now we have 5 people that don't know. It's like, okay, there we go. Okay, you guys just talk loud and we will write it down.
Mutations happen. Let's talk about mutations.
Okay.
All right.
So basically,
So we're going to start here in the back. How is your group assembled? Is it just you 5? So you joined a group of 4 to make 5? Do you need more time?
we all got settled.
Okay. Okay. A minute? That's a lot of time. Okay.
What am I doing? I'm a leader. Okay.
So if somebody in your group has some clue as to what are some of the pathologies of having more than 2 copies, and you're sitting in a group and you know some of that, contribute that to this discussion, because it's helpful for understanding why can we only have 2 copies. All right?
So I put out that. And someone explain more. So it's called trisomy disorders. They provide a level of redundancy.
Yes.
Where'd you learn that?
But there's probably more.
There's an over sign. Huh? Yeah.
Oh, so there's also
Yeah, having too much genetic information.
Well, if you have less than, it can cause this thing like
you can't function.
More than it changes things that should have.
if there's a limit to what more than is before death and
Affects
less
people
than.
less than.
So basically having too much very, yeah, results in very delicate, yeah. Oh, okay, actually that makes sense.
Call me delicate for more.
All right. So if you had, if a cell has 3 entire copies of the genome, we would refer to that cell as being triploid. However, if you have 3 of just one of the chromosomes, you don't refer to that as being triploid, you refer to that as trisomy. And then trisomy of whichever the chromosome is that you have 3 copies of. The most common of all of the trisomies is trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome. Okay, and it's, what's that? Well, I'm sorry, but we didn't talk at all about the pathology, just the disease. So, are you all 2 separate groups? You're one group. Do you have a representative? Okay. Natalie.
Awesome. So, okay, so if you have more than what's needed, it can cause just developmental defects.
Yep.
And that's just the slight number. And if you
Sure.
have less than, it's more likely to not have life, like survive.
Yeah, most trisomy conditions are rapidly fatal. Most of the chromosomes, if you have an extra copy of them, the embryo never completely develops. It just happens that trisomy 21, oftentimes the embryo can complete developing, but with a number of developmental abnormalities. Yeah. All right. Where's another? Jimmy, what group are you in? Oh, okay. You're the 9th member. Okay, so Kaylin, you're with this group back there? Okay. Who's your representative? All right, no, what's up?
So we talked about the possibility of, having 2 copies of the genome would make it more likely to have something go wrong, like having an extra chromosome or not one. And then we also talked about just like how if one chromosome, or not one chromosome, one copy of the genome is sufficient, then having 2 copies seems kind of like a waste of space.
It would be redundant for sure. Yeah, and so yeah, we'll come back to that idea. What do y'all have back here?
Well, we talked about how just like an extra copy isn't as designed to be just
Okay.
meiosis and stuff.
Okay.
That overloads and like with too much information.
Yeah, so some of these highly controlled processes, especially meiosis and mitosis, they're designed to handle 2 copies of the genome. And so you have some issues in how those work if you were to have extra copies. Those would need to be designed in different ways. So.
We also said that it might be a Down syndrome, but a lot of like if with the extra copy it results in like a miscarriage or just something really bad. So you guys need to get that information.
Yeah.
We kind of talked along the same lines of the Down syndrome. It's basically the idea that extra genetic information causes changes that should not occur in the organism, like different syndromes or deformities or mutation.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, the 3 biggest issues with having more than 2 copies or having less than 2 copies are, 1, the processes like mitosis and meiosis, these highly controlled processes that are designed to handle 2 copies. That's one of the biggest issue. The next biggest issue is fertilization. Fertilization, that process, is basically structured to handle one set of chromosomes joining a second set of chromosomes. So when you start changing developmental or chromosomal numbers, which happens often in plants, plants can function with extra sets of the chromosomes, but a lot of those weird structures are sterile. And so we actually use this to make like seedless watermelons or seedless oranges. We'll actually get them to have this trisomy condition, and they're sterile and don't make seeds, which makes them a lot more pleasurable to eat, right? So we can actually manipulate this process. So it becomes really difficult to carry out those processes with different numbers. And then the other one is you have to remember that on the chromosomes are genes. And what do genes do? Yeah, they're the blueprints. They're controlling what gets made, how it gets made. And so if you have extra copies of that, it becomes very difficult for the cell to regulate how much product gets made. Okay? And so if you have extra copies, it makes it very difficult for the cell to regulate how much product gets made. And so development usually rapidly spirals out of control because the cells have a very difficult time regulating the amount of product. Yeah.
Just a question about mutations. Like, does 3
Yeah, it would be the mutation that triggers having an extra copy of that gene. And so this whole process, usually like trisomy 21, what happens to generate trisomy 21 is usually when the homologous chromosomes are lining up during meiosis 1, they don't segregate. So both the maternal and the paternal get dragged over into one nucleus. And so you call that non-disjunction. They didn't separate and they didn't segregate. And so one of the cells got both copies, one of the cell got no copies, and then so now if that gamete that has an extra copy fuses with a gamete from, let's say that's the ovum, and it has 2 copies of chromosome 21, and it fuses with the male sperm with 1 copy itself. Now you have 3 copies of chromosome 21. And that's usually, and you would call that a chromosomal mutation. Yeah, and it's a developmental mutation, but yeah, it would be the mutation that triggered the trisomy condition. All right, so with a lot of these, either the videos that would help would be really boring, or they'd be very uncomfortable. So we don't have as many videos as we normally do, which would be nice for some people, because some people have sent me emails telling me of their displeasure with having so many videos that don't relate. I'm just kidding. Nobody's done that. You're going to do it right now? Yeah, Maurice's doing it right now. It was really awkward on Tuesday, the awkward transitions, and that I'm sorry for. All right, so our next framing question. What are the unique features of mature gametes? So as we look at a sperm and we look at an ovum, how are they different from each other, and how do they differ from cells that aren't gametes? Which any cell that is not a gamete we refer to as a somatic cell. Somatic cell. All right, remember from the previous slide that gametes are haploid, at least in humans. Gametes are haploid. Now, the process of meiosis is what generates those haploid cells. But that process is different in males than it is in females. Okay, it's different in males than it is in females. Meiosis in males produces 4 haploid sperm. So from every cell, from every germ cell that starts that process of meiosis, you get 4 haploid sperm. In females, every cell division, every meiotic event does not generate 4 haploid sex cells. Instead, it generates a single ovum and 3 polar bodies that are just going to be destroyed, that are going to be broken down and recycled. And so what that means then is that males are generating 4 cells for every 1 sex cell that females are generating. Okay, so there's already a difference there, and it should make sense because ova are large, sperm are really small, and so the energy investment in 1 large cell is a little bit different than the energy investment in 4 small cells. Another difference is the process of meiosis in females stops. It doesn't complete. The process in males is constantly happening to generate more and more and more sperm. In females, the process stops during meiosis 2, specifically at the point at which these chromosomes line up, which is called metaphase. So it stops in metaphase 2 and doesn't finish until fertilization. So the ovum is never fully mature until it is fertilized. And that's a really important concept to remember because it gives you a great deal of information as far as why doesn't a unfertilized ovum implant? And why does the process of menstruation continue then? So that ovum never fully matures and never finishes developing until it's actually fertilized. And when it's fertilized, it finishes going through meiosis, and then it's developmentally mature. All right, some other differences. Sperm have very little cytoplasm, very little of the fluid component of the cell, whereas ova have a lot. They have a great deal of cytoplasm. A lot of cytoplasm, and sperm have very little. One of the things that contributes to their difference in size. Sperm are flagellated, ova are not. Sperm are flagellated for movement. They have to actually swim against the direction in which the ova are traveling and are being forced out, sperm have to travel against that. So sperm have flagella for making that journey. And then on the head of the sperm, there are a lot of enzymes for helping them to penetrate the lining of the ovum so that fertilization can take place. So those are some of the unique features of these gametes when you compare them to each other. And then when you compare them to somatic cells, the biggest difference is gametes are haploid, somatic cells are what? Are diploid. Okay, and then there are obviously some structural differences. The ovum is huge compared to a typical somatic cell. Sperm are really small compared to a typical somatic cell. And then obviously sperm have other features that they need for their specific function. All right, so we're going to get into the next of our lecture break questions. And yeah, it really works out well if you have groups of 6/7/8 and not 4 or 5 or 9. But I mean, y'all are adults. If you want to, have groups that are a different size, I guess I can't stop you. But group leaders do try. The challenge with 9 is you still need to try to get everybody engaged. And actually, this group now has 10. But you do need to try to get everybody engaged and everybody's voice heard. All right. So, why does the ovum have so much cytoplasm? Why is the ovum so big? And what does that actually mean for the embryo? Okay, so think about that. Why is the cytoplasm of the ovum so large? Why does it have so much cytoplasm? And what does that actually mean for the embryo? So the embryo doesn't come until fertilization has taken place. The zygote starts to divide, and now you have an embryo. What does that actually mean for that embryo? Thinking about that most of its cytoplasm came from a very specific place. Okay, take a couple of minutes, talk through this, come up with some ideas of what this means for the embryo, and also some ideas of why the ovum has so much cytoplasm. All right, take a couple of minutes, starting now.
I'm just emailing you. It's a really good video that I found on fertilization. It's like the most legit.
Is it the introduction from Look Who's Talking? Have you seen that movie? Because I was really tempted to pull that opening scene from Look Who's Talking.
Yeah. No, this one's not funny, but it's exhausting. You're like, oh my gosh, what sperm have to do.
I have a video of sperm traveling through the reproductive tract. So.
And this video ends with life starts at fertilization. So I'm like, okay, it's legit. We're gonna split our group up, but
You're going to reproduce. You're not going to split the group up. That works. A split sounds like there was some conflict.
Okay, what's the question? All right. I believe it has so much cytoplasm.
Because pretty much as soon as it leaves, like, it's fertilized.
To be a cell, it has cytoplasm.
And then cells start.
You don't want to over cytoplasm. It helps once the sperm is in the ovum to
30 seconds.
move the way it needs to. Period.
All right. So now, since this is two separate groups, okay, we're gonna start here. We're gonna move our way back, and then we'll come back up. And I want you to share either an answer to the first part of the question, why is there so much cytoplasm, or share some idea of what does that actually mean for the embryo. All right.
So I think you said that it provides the nutrients, right? So once fertilization takes place, the process can already start. It has the energy that it
Sure,
needs.
yeah. I mean, one of those cells has to bring the food to the party, right? I mean, all of that process, the process of development, it's an expensive process. Requires energy, requires other nutrients, and so somebody has to bring that to the party. And the ovum's the one that does it. The sperm doesn't bring much to the party. All right.
I talked about how the sperm can travel more easily if there's more cytoplasm, so that it can move through the ovum.
Okay, good. And then, so a byproduct of that, if the sperm has less cytoplasm, it can move more quickly, right? The sperm are lighter. They're a lot more mobile. They can move with a single flagellum, which is not a particularly great way of moving a large cell, but is a great way of moving a small cell. All right, have some ideas back here? No ideas yet as far as what does this mean for the embryo?
So you're talking about how it can also serve to protect what's inside of it.
Sure.
Yeah, and then also it provides the nutrients needed and the genetic material for cell division.
Yeah, and that protection is a big part because females are making a fraction of the number of sex cells that males are, right? And so they're a lot more expensive and therefore a lot more valuable. That's a good thing to keep in mind. All right, what do we have back here?
We talked about how the large amount of cytoplasm in the female sex cell we were talking about how it potentially could turn into maybe like the placenta or like the amniotic fluid in some sense to help eventually after a lot of cell division to help protect the embryo as well as ready for birth.
Right, so not with the embryo, that process of development, yeah, it's expensive, but then you have to develop just a lot. And so the ovum needs to be a particular size just to have the amount of material necessary to get some of those processes started. Yeah, the placenta is made by both the embryo and the mother. It's a joint structure made by both. And so a good deal of that development is the responsibility of the embryo. Have some ideas here?
So when the sperm meets up with the ovum, the first process of the development of an embryo is that there's cell division within that. And so it needs that space within the ovum to do that.
Right, and that development has to happen quickly. So the initial sections of cell development need to happen quickly, more quickly than could be provided if you had to grow the cell and then divide it. And so the ovum being really large and having a great deal of cytoplasm allows that development to happen really quickly without generating a great deal of growth in the cells. And so your first steps of development usually just don't result in an embryo that's any larger than it was as a zygote, just a single cell. It's just cells that are copying the nuclei and then separating them out. And then you'll start to get some cell growth later in development. So what does this mean for the embryo? So inside of the sperm, I mean, you have the typical things you find inside of a cell. You've got a nucleus, you've got mitochondria, you have some other organelles, but mostly just the nucleus from the sperm ends up inside of the ovum. Nothing else really. Well, they have very little cytoplasm, so it's not like they're going to contribute a bunch of nutrients, right? But their mitochondria are basically spent. The mitochondria are working so hard to get the flagellum to spin enough to get the sperm to where they need to go that the mitochondria are almost just worn out and destroyed by that time. And so it's basically just the nucleus of the sperm that makes it into the ovum, which means that the sperm is not, the sperm is not contributing anything except for genetic material, meaning everything else comes from your mother. And that's a very important concept to understand. And so there are some of those there's the mitochondria specifically, they have their own DNA. But almost all of your mitochondria come from your mother. Very seldom does the sperm contribute any of its mitochondria. Meaning you're actually slightly more than half your mom genetically. It's not quite an even 50-50 split because your accessory DNA that's not inside the nucleus comes almost entirely from your mother. And this is true of almost all sexually reproducing animals.
Is that part of the reason why every person has an X chromosome?
No, I mean, the reason why every person has an X chromosome is females only have an X chromosome and they have to contribute a sex chromosome to the gamete. And so they only have the only option they have is to contribute an X, right? And then the male could contribute an X or a Y, but everybody's gonna, and that's not necessarily true. It is possible to have no X chromosome. You have some really big developmental issues, but it is possible to actually have no X chromosome. And it's also possible for females to only have one X chromosome instead of two. I think it's called Turner syndrome, when you have one X chromosome instead of two. And it is also possible to have three X chromosomes instead of two. And it's possible for males to have two X chromosome and one Y. Anyways, another conversation for another time. So what it means for the embryo is basically everything beyond the DNA comes from your maternal inheritance. And so it's an important concept when we talk about development next week. So ovulation, the process of releasing an oocyte. We'll talk more about this as we talk through the hormonal regulation of the menstruation cycle. But I just want to point out something from this diagram. One is it talks about an oocyte, an immature egg cell is released into the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. And again, it doesn't finish that process of maturation until it's fertilized. Okay? It's immature all the way up until the point in which it is fertilized. So here's the diagram from the text. It doesn't show up well on a slide, but I wanted to point this out. And then there's another diagram showing the process of meiosis in female gametes. And these are really, really nice diagrams for helping you to see how does the process of meiosis work in males, how does the process of meiosis work in females. Ultimately, both processes are generating a haploid sex cell. It's just in males you're generating 4 sperm, and they're mature, basically, at the end of meiosis. They do need to mature a little bit, but the ova, take a really long time to finish that process. So this is a nice diagram for illustrating the simplicity of the design of the sperm. And so you'll see these mitochondria, and they're in this middle section here. And this section very rarely ever enters into the ova. And so again, most of your components, not just the cytoplasm, but most of the cellular components are coming from your mother and not from your father. And so here is the process of meiosis in female cells. Again, it doesn't show up great on a slide. I just want to show you right here where you're generating 1 sex cell for every process of meiosis in female gametogenesis, and you generate 4 sex cells for every process of meiosis in male gametogenesis. Gametogenesis is that process of making gametes. All right? Any questions about how sperm are different from ova, or how gametes are different from somatic cells? Okay. So what is the path that sperm travel to the oocyte, this immature ovum? So the reason why I asked this question, it's something that you probably have seen before, is it gives us a good opportunity to actually talk about the function of the various reproductive systems. So the function or the purpose of the male reproductive tract is to make sperm, store sperm, and deposit sperm into the female reproductive tract. Seems fairly straightforward. The female reproductive tract has similar functions, but it's making oocytes, storing oocytes, and releasing oocytes, but it also has to facilitate the fertilization. Fertilization takes place internally in humans. In some animals, it takes place externally, and so females don't have kind of the same requirements with regards to their reproductive tracts. And it has to protect and nourish the developing embryo. And that is a big task. That is a big task, and it requires several structures that you don't find in the male reproductive system. So the path that the sperm take, they have to travel up the vagina, through the cervix, which usually is closed, but actually relaxes right about the time of ovulation to open up a little bit so that sperm can actually make it through the entire uterus, which if there's no developing embryo inside is really, really small, and then up one of the fallopian tubes or uterine tubes. The thing is, you just have to guess, because females typically release a single oocyte at a time, and out of one of the ovaries, which means only one of those uterine or fallopian tubes actually have an oocyte, an immature ova. So the sperm have to guess correctly if they're going to have an opportunity to fertilize the oocyte. So fertilization generally occurs here in the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, whatever you want to call it. The textbook calls it the uterine tube. Other sources are going to refer to it as the fallopian tube. And so fertilization almost always takes place there. It is possible for it to take place in the uterus, but it's very uncommon. And so our next lecture break question deals with that. Why wouldn't fertilization occur in the uterus? Why is it most common that fertilization takes place inside of the uterine tube or the fallopian tube? What still needs to happen before implantation can occur? Okay, take a couple minutes, come up with a list of developmental features that still need to happen before implantation can occur. Mauricio, I wish you would have done this on your cafe. You what? I wish you would have done this on your cafe and not just in an email. Because
I do.
Yes, your name is Mingle.
And my wife is Jordan Ingle, so she's Jingle. We are Mingle and Jingle. And both my parents are Dingle. That one's a fun one.
All the time.
You got another 30 seconds or so. All right, before we start a discussion, I want to read to you an email that I received. How dare you have so many nonsensical videos? You are the worst professor I have ever had in my life. Underlined and bolded, worst professor. And this is from Mauricio. Sent 7 minutes ago. Nope, 22 minutes. Oh, P.S. Your email is Mingle. And that made me chuckle. Thanks, Mauricio. All right. So we're going to start here, and we're going to make our way this way. All right. So why wouldn't fertilization occur in the uterus?
As soon as the egg is fertilized, it has to fuse to the wall of the uterus, and that can't really I feel like it would be a lot easier for fertilization to occur in the fallopian tubes than just travel down into the uterus than for it to be kind of floating in space and then try to find.
Yeah, so part of that is the fallopian tube is a much smaller volume. Yeah, much smaller volume. And so it makes it a lot more likely that if sperm are in there, they are actually going to come in contact with the ovum. Yeah, it's a big part of it. It's a big part of it. The actual shape of the fallopian tube facilitates that fertilization.
We were just saying it would be easier for the sperm to get together.
Sure.
It's not as big it's a smaller space.
Yep, good. All right. Have
We
some.
were talking about how when they come in contact in the uterus, it can cause infection, which is all the little pieces. So they come in contact with each other in the fallopian tubes instead, and that helps reduce the risk of inflammation because there's just not as much space, and so you don't have to worry about stuff floating up and getting infected.
Okay. I like it. What do we have here?
We talked about how the uterus has to thicken, and that takes some time.
Uh-huh.
I think if it just went while that was happening, it would just mess up development, and it could just, I don't know, get washed out or something, or it just.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you've got to prepare the lining of the uterus, and that process does take some time, and yeah, and so part of that process is triggered by the actual fertilization event. Yeah.
We talked about timing, so if it was fertilized in the uterus, if the uterus doesn't have that implantation, the uterus wall is going to shed. So and it needs that time to separate or divide to become that zygote to be able to stick to the uterine wall. And if it
Yeah, you have to keep in mind the oocyte is not fully developed, right? The oocyte is immature until after fertilization. And so it's not even a fully developed sex cell until after fertilization starts. And then it'll kick in that process and finish developing. So the ovum's not even an ovum yet. It's still an oocyte, an immature cell. On top of that, there's some nice aspects of making the sperm travel a really long distance. What it does is it makes it less likely that bad sperm are going to be able to fertilize the ovum. The harder that journey is, the more likely it is that only the best sperm are going to make it. And the best sperm should have the best combinations of what the male has to offer. Okay? And so there's some nice function there and opportunity. So here is a figure that just shows you the pathway that sperm have to take. And so you can see the uterus, when it doesn't have a developing embryo inside, is incredibly small. However, it is still a significant structure that the sperm need to travel through. And we're going to watch a little video right now, and you're going to see, on top of the difficulty of moving through a structure like that, there are cells inside that are supposed to detect foreign material, and these sperm are foreign material. So, here we go.
Fertilization is the epic story of a single sperm facing incredible odds to unite with an egg and form a new
This is the
human
only video
life.
we're going to have today, so
It is the
enjoy
story of all of us.
Mauricio.
During sexual intercourse, about 300 million sperm enter the vagina. Soon afterward, millions of them will either flow out of the vagina or die in its acidic environment. However, many survive because of the protective elements provided in the fluids surrounding them. Next, the sperm must pass through the cervix, an opening into the uterus. Usually, it remains tightly closed, but here the cervix is open for a few days while the woman ovulates. The sperm swim through the cervical mucus, which is thinned to a more watery consistency for easier passage. Once inside the cervix, the sperm continues swimming toward the uterus, though millions will die trying to make it through the mucus. Some sperm remain behind, caught in the folds of the cervix, but they may later continue the journey as a backup to the first group. Inside the uterus, muscular uterine contractions assist the sperm on their journey toward the egg. However, resident cells from the woman's immune system, mistaking the sperm for foreign invaders, destroy thousands more. Next, half the sperm head for the empty fallopian tube, while the other half swim toward the tube containing the unfertilized egg. Now, only a few thousand remain. Inside the fallopian tube, tiny cilia push the egg toward the uterus. To continue, the sperm must surge against this motion to reach the egg. Some sperm get trapped in the cilia and die. During this part of the journey, chemicals in the reproductive tract cause the membranes covering the heads of the sperm to change. As a result, the sperm become hyperactive, swimming harder and faster toward their destination. At long last, the sperm reach the egg. Only a few dozen of the original 300 million sperm remain.
300 million.
The egg is covered with a layer of cells called the corona radiata. The sperm must push through this layer to reach the outer layer of the egg, the zona pellucida. When sperm reach the zona pellucida, they attach to specialized sperm receptors on the surface, which triggers their acrosomes to release digestive enzymes, enabling the sperm to burrow into the layer. Inside the zona pellucida is a narrow, fluid-filled space just outside the egg cell membrane. The first sperm to make contact will fertilize the egg. After a perilous journey and against incredible odds, a single sperm attaches to the egg cell membrane.
Special moment.
Within a few minutes, their outer membranes fuse and the egg pulls the sperm inside. This event causes changes in the egg membrane that prevent other sperm from attaching to it. Next, the egg releases chemicals that push other sperm away from the egg and create an impenetrable fertilization membrane. As the reaction spreads outward, the zona pellucida hardens, trapping any sperm unlucky enough to be caught inside. Outside the egg, sperm are no longer able to attach to the zona pellucida. Meanwhile, inside the egg, the tightly packed male genetic material spreads out. A new membrane forms around the genetic material, creating the male pronucleus. Inside, the genetic material reforms into 23 chromosomes. The female genetic material, awakened by the fusion of the sperm with the egg, finishes dividing, resulting in the female pronucleus, which also contains 23 chromosomes. As the male and female pronuclei form, spiderweb-like threads, called microtubules, pull them toward each other. The two sets of chromosomes join together, completing the process of fertilization. At this moment, a unique genetic code arises, instantly determining gender, hair color, eye color, and hundreds of other characteristics. This new single cell, the zygote, is the beginning of a new human being. And now the cilia in the fallopian tube gently sweep the zygote toward the uterus, where he or she will implant in the rich uterine lining, growing and maturing for the next 9 months until...
And so again, it allows that process to continue, the ovum to finish developing, for that fertilization to take place, some cell divisions to take place prior to implantation.
So you said only like one oocyte is produced in each of like fallopian tubes, or
Release typically at any given cycle. Yeah, you typically release a single. Now some women release more than one in every cycle, and so you have some women, it's fairly common to have fraternal twins in their families, and so they just regularly release more than one ovum.
that mean they go into menopause quicker?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, you only have a certain number. The average female enters puberty with 400,000 oocytes. And so you have 400,000 oocytes at your disposal to release throughout your life. Not all of them are going to fully get to the process of releasing. And so, yeah, it is potential if you're releasing more than one at a time to run out sooner and enter into menopause earlier. All right. Yeah.
Because identical twins happen at random when the fertilization happens, what's gonna happen?
Yeah, it's not completely random.
But more random than fraternal twins. I feel that's more genetic.
Maybe.
But
Yeah.
Is it like with as a woman gets older and comes closer to entering menopause, does her body go into kind of a going out of business sale where it tends to release more eggs?
No, not necessarily. No. And there, as far as I know, there's no correlation between the age of the female and the number of oocytes released. There is a correlation between the quality of the oocytes and the age of the female. Yeah.
So because we were learning about the Down syndrome ones, and that more commonly that happens
In older women.
What's the connection in that?
So all of the ova that you're going to have, we should say oocytes because they're not developed until they're fertilized. All of the oocytes you're going to have in your entire life are in place when puberty begins. And they're all developmentally arrested in metaphase 2, at the point at which the chromosomes are lined up and each copy needs to be segregated into separate cells. The older those cells get, the lower the quality is of the protein fibers that are holding those chromosomes together, and the more likely it is to get non-disjunction, to get it to where both copies of that single chromosome, either the maternal or the paternal, end up in the same cell.
So it really can come from both sides. It's not like a woman's.
It can come from both sides. It's most often from the woman, yeah. But it is possible that non-disjunction can happen in both male and female gametes. But most often it's female gametes where the non-disjunction happens. All right, so our fourth framing question: how is the menstrual cycle regulated? This one has the most physiology we've probably ever had on a slide. And for that, I was going to say I'm sorry, I'm not. But I recognize it's not a physiology class, and we haven't talked a great deal about hormones because that's saved for physiology. But we do need to talk a little bit about some of these sex hormones. So you have to, something you have to note is the ovum, or the oocyte. It actually would be correctly said the oocyte is inside of a follicle. So a follicle is a fluid-filled sac that the oocyte is inside of. At the side of the follicle, you have a membrane called the corpus luteum. And so this corpus luteum forms around a maturing follicle. So as a follicle gets close to the end of its maturation, where the oocyte is growing and getting larger and developing some, but it's not going to finish developing until fertilization happens, this corpus luteum forms. This corpus luteum begins to degrade as the oocyte is being ready to be released. And when it does, it stops producing progesterone. So progesterone is a hormone that works in a number of ways. But one of those things that the progesterone does is basically inhibit estrogen production and some of the other hormones that are produced. So as this starts to degrade, you start to produce less progesterone, and this triggers certain events. First thing it triggers is the shedding of the mucus lining of the uterus, the endometrium. So as this corpus luteum starts to degrade, progesterone production declines, the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, sheds. It also triggers the release of several hormones. So this first hormone, GnRH, if you want to know what that stands for, it's gonadotropin releasing hormone. You don't need to know what that stands for. GnRH is fine. But this triggers the release of GnRH, which this triggers the release of these two hormones. And the name of these hormones are unfortunate because it makes you think that they're only present in females. And so it's kind of nice to just know them as their acronyms, because then you lose some of that confusion. Because the actual name for this is follicle stimulating hormone. Only females have follicles. So it makes it seem like this hormone is only active in females. This is leucitizing hormone, which is the process of releasing the immature oocyte. But these are present in males as well. And then this also triggers more estrogen production. All right, so now estrogen starts to prepare the body for developing an embryo. So it rebuilds the lining of the endometrium, rebuilds that mucus lining of the uterus. FSH stimulates follicles to finish developing, the follicles that are getting close to that point to finish developing. And then LH, a big surge in that, triggers the ovulation, the release of that oocyte. Now, after ovulation, the corpus luteum reforms, this structure that's going to be releasing progesterone, reforms from cells that are present there and starts releasing progesterone that will prepare the endometrium for implantation. Okay, so after the egg is released, progesterone starts to be produced again and prepares the endometrium for implantation. This is one of those features that has to take place after the ovum is released, and why the ovum needs to spend some time in the uterine tube or in the fallopian tube. Now, if the ovum is unfertilized, and again, it'd probably be more correctly stated, the oocyte is unfertilized, the corpus luteum degrades and the process starts over. The lining of the endometrium is shed, and so you have this very cyclical process where an ovum or an oocyte is released from a follicle. You start to prepare the lining of your uterus for implantation. If it doesn't get fertilized, implantation doesn't happen, and progesterone production, or when that starts to lower, the lining, the endometrium, is shed again. You get this cyclical process. Now, what's interesting is in most mammals, this process only happens once or twice a year. Okay, it only happens once or twice a year, and you call it, like if you have a dog, you call it them coming into heat when they actually ovulate. Maybe once or dogs can do it 3 or 4 times a year, but most mammals, it's not very cyclical. It's not every 28 days. And so what I want you to do during the next lecture break is put some thought into and some discussion into why does this process occur every 28 days in females from puberty until the ova are gone, until oocytes are gone, or at least high quality oocytes developing and good follicles are gone. So why does this process occur a lot more regularly in humans than it does in other mammals? All right, take a couple of minutes, talk through this, and then we'll discuss this together. Well, I don't think that's going to necessarily be true if the, and then replace your second lowest with a higher one. Okay. I don't know right now if there are going to be any other assignments.
Maybe like the guys
All right. So, what are some ideas? And this, instead of going group by group, we'll just take volunteers. Any groups feel like you want to share your thoughts? Because we're running a little bit low on, yeah.
So we talked a lot about how if there isn't like if the excess stuff isn't gotten rid of, it will build up in the body and that can cause issues with all that material that's broken down. So you just have a lot of waste products sitting around, which is just really harmful to the host. So it has to get rid of that so that it can continue on with normal life.
Okay.
Christian brought up a really good point of, yeah, you're out of this. That unlike other like animals or mammals, they produce a lot at a time, at one time, but our bodies can't handle that, and so it needs to happen more often than.
Yeah, so our gestation period is really long. I mean, it's not the longest of all mammals. It's, maybe 4 to 5 weeks longer than a chimpanzee, which is pretty equal in size and supposedly our closest relative. It's about equal to what a cow's is, which is always kind of fascinating to me, that a baby human is on average 7 pounds at birth. A baby cow is on average like 100 pounds at birth, and the gestation period is basically the exact same, 38 to 40 weeks. Which has always fascinated me. So it's not the longest, but it is long, and it's taxing. It's an expensive process. And so you're right, we do typically have small litters, right? A single child at a time. And so you have different reproductive strategies, right? So there's one strategy, produce a lot of offspring, right? And then just kind of hope for the best. Or another strategy is produce few offspring and invest a lot in trying to get those offspring to survive. And humans, we have that strategy, and so part of that is just it's a little bit more regular unless you're pregnant. Any other ideas? Yeah.
Talk about animals are constantly moving and adapting to their habitat, because in humans we don't really do that. We basically have a pretty much stable environment.
Yeah, we sit down and make our environment what we want it to be, right?
And humans also have they mostly have a longer lifespan than animals.
Yeah, so it's interesting when you look at lifespan in mammals. There's a really strong correlation between the size of the mammal and how long it lives, and a really strong correlation between how long it lives and when it reaches sexual maturity. But that's another discussion for another time. Another reason, which I'm not surprised that nobody wanted to talk about. But animals that only come into estrus once or twice a year are not receptive to having sex when they're outside of estrus, typically. But sex exists in humans, according to scripture, for more than just procreation, right? It is also designed as a mechanism by which two individuals literally become a single individual, reaching a level of intimacy that's supposed to be part of the union between one man and one woman. So sex has a different goal than just procreation in humans. And so there's some kind of a biological element as far as when a female is receptive to the process. All right, so a couple figures from chapter 27 that, again, a lot of these figures don't look good on slides, and I don't even know why they go through the difficulty of putting them on a slide, but it does give me the opportunity to point these out to you. So figure 2713 and 2715 both talk about this hormonal control of this process of estrus, of menstruation, and they're both really helpful to just kind of sort things out. They get the events in the cascade correct, in the correct order, and in the correct progression. All right, last framing question. How do the reproductive tracts develop, and when do the hormones kick in? So first thing that you need to know, and I didn't write this on the slide, but we're going to answer this right away. When do the hormones kick in? The sex hormones kick in pretty early on. Right? Pretty early on in development, you'll start, if you're going to develop into male, you'll start producing testosterone. And pretty early on in development, both embryos are producing estrogen. But so in males, if you have a Y chromosome, it doesn't really matter how many X chromosomes you have, but if you have a Y chromosome, you're going to start producing high levels of testosterone. And what that does is it stimulates growth and development in what's called the Wolffian duct, which develops into the male reproductive system. So secretions from cells inside of this duct, called the sustentacular cells, trigger the degradation of the separate duct that develops into the female reproductive system. And so both male and females in development have the foundation or the scaffold for both reproductive tracts. And if testosterone production starts and picks up, the duct, the Mullerian duct that would develop into the female reproductive tract, gets degraded and recycled. And you start focusing your attention on the Wolffian duct. So without these secretions, without the testosterone secretion, the Wolffian duct will degrade instead. And so again, both ducts are present. It's just a matter of what starts getting triggered at a particular point in development. So what changes at puberty is not that you start producing sex hormones for the first time. You're producing sex hormones throughout your life. What happens at puberty is the sensitivity of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland decrease. And so they start to become less and less receptive to signals telling them to not produce LH and FSH. And these are hormones that I told you it's kind of helpful just to know them as their acronyms, because then it eliminates the confusion about thinking that these are just female hormones. And so both males and females at the time of puberty, your hypothalamus and pituitary glands stop being as sensitive to hormones that are telling them to not produce LH and FSH, and so they become more likely to release those hormones. Also at puberty, the gonads become more sensitive to these hormones, LH and FSH, and they grow and mature. And they start producing more and more of those secondary sex hormones, testosterone in the testes, progesterone in ovaries, and ultimately estrogen at certain times. And so this is what happens at puberty. It's not a matter of these sex hormones showing up for the first time. It's a difference in sensitivity and making sure that your body releases more and more of the hormones that finish the development of the sex organs and keep that process happening. So that females can continue to produce follicles every 28 days that will release an immature oocyte, and males can continue to develop more and more sperm. And so what I want you to do with our last lecture break question is I want you to think through this. Why do humans take so long to reach sexual maturity? And so it may not seem like a long time to you, right? The average human, I think, reaches puberty somewhere between 12 and 15 years of age, whether it's male or female. Females tend to do it a little bit younger, but not significantly younger as far as I know. And so that may not seem like a long time, but it is compared to other animals. Why do we take so long to reach sexual maturity? Take a couple of minutes, talk through this, think through this with your groups, and then we'll finish our discussion.
And then also body development is being able to be able to experience the way our body is formed. Could you imagine I don't think you have to teach this as a child. No, you can't. Like, sometimes you start the body's not able to do that if it was a possibility.
So.
All right. So as we finish up our time together, are there any groups that want to share what your group was talking about? So we'll start with Dana, and then we'll move up here to Natalie.
We talked about a few things, but
Okay.
first of all, it's kind of the grace of God that a 10-year-old cannot have a child.
In normal circumstances, yeah. It is possible, yeah.
In normal circumstances.
Yep.
And just because, cognitively you're not ready for that responsibility and maturity-wise, but also, sea turtles don't sexually start reproducing until about 20. So it's the organisms that have longer lifespan take longer to develop for that.
They sure do. Yeah, there is a very strong correlation between when you reach sexual maturity and the length of your life. Yeah. And so the earlier in your development that you reach sexual maturity, the earlier your body tends to reach senescence and start to shut down. Yeah. And so, there's this whole thing of when do you start really start progressing towards, it's interesting. There are two stages in most animals' existence. There's the developmental stage and the decline stage. There's not really a long period of stasis. It's like you're focusing a ton of attention in growth and development, and then everything just starts deteriorating towards senescence. And so that point in mammals really shifts when they reach puberty. When a mammal reaches puberty, everything really starts shifting towards the decline and away from the growth and development. Yeah.
Yeah, we kind of talk about the same thing, and if you go with the aspect of looking at it as a creator standpoint, for humans, sex isn't just about reproduction.
Sure.
It is about the unity. So, with that being said, just maturity level of us in general, and being able to become into that. Also, being able to hold a child and
Sure.
deliver.
Yeah, the thing is, it's not just reproductive development, right? Other aspects of physical development need to get to a certain point. Since a female human has to protect this developing embryo and then fetus for 38 to 40 weeks, that's a big investment and requires a certain level of developmental maturity, not just reproductive developmental maturity, but the other physical aspects of your body, and obviously some emotional maturity. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? All right. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. I'll see you all next week. It will.